Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 15 of the American Pageant titled The Ferment of Reform and Culture from 1790 to 1860. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. To start off, here are the key concepts for this chapter. These are located at the beginning of every chapter in the American Pageant. Obviously, I say this every time, but definitely try to match the key terms to each of the bullet points here so that you can organize the information and recall it really quickly on the AP exam. It's super important to memorize the overarching ideas and sentiments of an era and not just the key terms. So definitely try to do that if you have the time. And this will be really easy to do with this chapter because, as you can tell, there are a lot less key concepts compared to other chapters. So if you haven't already tried it, I definitely recommend you start with this chapter. Okay, so first let's talk about religion. Religion is definitely a key concept in this chapter and definitely something you should know about, especially because as the nation's politics and economy grew, some people believed that religion should play a greater role in daily life in order to produce civil and God-fearing citizens. Back in the colonial days, people were very religious, and that created this sort of social responsibility for one another. And now people are concerned that as people move to the cities and have their own needs to worry about, their own family's needs, their individual needs, they aren't going to really look out for the greater good, and that is very concerning to some people. And keep in mind that religion is no longer the Calvinism from colonial times. There are a lot more new and liberal ideas about religion that are emerging during this time. If you remember, from Calvinism, there was this idea of predestination. The idea that you had a set place in heaven or hell and you couldn't really do much about it unless you experienced a conversion, which was this sort of religious awakening where God would tell you that you were actually destined for heaven. From then on, you would have to lead a very saintly life. But this no longer applied in these new industrializing times. People honestly don't really have time for it, so they're going to find other ways of expressing religion, often more liberal and lenient ways. And you can see this sort of nationwide shift from traditional religious values to this more liberal and lenient version in The Age of Reason, written in 1794 by Thomas Paine, and it essentially declared that all churches were set up to terrify and enslave mankind in order to maintain their power in society. And this shows again the growing American anti-clericalism. People don't want to be religious anymore, and the church obviously has to maintain their power. They don't want people running away from them, so they have to make sure that people still believe there is some good in the church or that they need the church. And again, like I mentioned, there are these new liberal religions during this time. For example, you have deism, which believe that people should rely more on science and reason instead of the Bible, but still believe in the general idea of God or a general higher power. And these really challenge the ideas of predestination, of a set eternal fate, by saying that humans are capable of moral behavior, that they're able to, choose your own destiny or whatever. Because you know that Britney Spears ad where she goes to a fortune teller and the fortune teller is like, do you want to know what your future holds? And then she's like, no, I choose my own destiny. It was kind of like that. That's how I remember it. But yeah, aside from that, there's also Unitarianism, which was a less extreme version of Puritanism that emphasized the essential goodness of people, saying that people are really good in their hearts. And it said that humans also have free will and that salvation is possible through good deeds. In other words, they're seeing God as a loving father, not a strict higher power. God is forgiving and is able to understand human mistakes, and they're not going to condemn you to this eternal hell if you make one little mistake, as long as you fix it. And this again contrasted the hellfire doctrines of Calvinism. Calvinism kept people in line in some ways because it's saying, if you don't act a certain way, you will end up in hell. And now that these new liberal religions aren't saying that, people really aren't as scared anymore. Another thing you should know about is the idea of transcendentalism. This was a movement that emphasized individualism and said that everyone has a, quote, inner light or truth that allows them to directly speak to God. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a prominent transcendentalist at the time, if you remember last chapter, we talked about his work, Self-Reliant, and how that affected frontier people. He expands this movement as an influential writer during this time. But really, the thing driving people away from religion was the fact that there were so many restrictions that were placed just to be a part of the church or to even be considered holy, and this turned people away. Like, who has the time for that? People have these new jobs, new factory jobs, have to get up early and do all this stuff, and they can't just keep worrying about being religious and trying to achieve this almost impossible ideal because of how rigorous the prerequisites were to be even considered for being a member of the church. So again, people aren't really interested in it anymore because it's kind of seen almost as a waste of time, like, I'm never gonna get it, so why even bother? And this all leads to the Second Great Awakening. This is really similar to the First Great Awakening, and it starts in 1970 and goes to about 1860, and obviously this is a very gradual thing. It doesn't just, start and end exactly like that, but it's in general happening across the time period, and it again started over a lack of religious zeal and led to the creation of new denominations and inspired reform movements. Religion will inspire reform. Super, super important. If you're going to take anything away out of this chapter, it should be that. It also leads to increased church memberships and more democratic leaderships in churches. If you remember, Anglican churches were very strict. They had a certain almost hierarchical leadership, and people in America, with their political experiment in democracy that had proved to be successful to some extent, they did not like this almost monarchy type of ruling, and so this leads to more democracy within the leadership. And in terms of, religious grouping, this isn't really important, but it was in the textbook, so I thought I might as well mention it. In the Northeast, you have a lot of Presbyterians and Unitarians, and these members were often wealthy and better educated, while in the South and the West, you have mostly Methodists and Baptists, and the members were often less wealthy and rarely educated. And so to enforce the Great Awakening, these preachers, these itinerant preachers, would travel around the nation giving sermons at these camp meetings. A very famous example of this is Charles Finney, who gave up law to start preaching, and he condemned alcohol and slavery with his very persuasive oratory, again trying to persuade people that religion is something that is necessary and critical in their lives. The Second Great Awakening wasn't successful everywhere it went. For example, in the Burned Over district, this was an area in New York where many Puritans had settled, and they had already seen so many sermonizers preaching about hellfire doctrines and Calvinism that they had experienced this sort of burnout, and essentially they really had no religious zeal left in them, so it was kind of a lost cause. So let's talk a little bit about the effects of the Second Great Awakening. For one, this inspires the creation of the Mormons, and essentially what happens is Joseph Smith says he gets some gold plates from an angel, and when he deciphered them, this becomes the Book of Mormon. The Mormons then decide to travel across the country and to the West, and they faced opposition as many of them were accused of polygamy. Smith is murdered and the religion is near collapse, but a man named Brigham Young saves them with his stern personality and good leadership skills, finally settling the group in Utah. And they managed to develop a frontier society that, that's a typo, that thrived off cooperation, which contrasts the individualistic ideals of the frontier at the time. Again, remember self-reliance from the last chapter. People can't rely on other people because that's just the way frontier life was, but the Mormons create a different society. And this eventually becomes a state in 1896, but it took so long because of the controversy with polygamy. Okay, so let's talk about Jacksonian Era Reform. Remember, religion inspires reform. This is a super important idea that you should take away from the chapter. And there are a couple areas in which we'll see development and reform as a result of the actions of various people. One area, for example, is education. And to provide a little bit of background, tax-supported public schools were very uncommon during this time, but the rich soon realized that they needed to educate the poor, who might turn on them and vote against the rich when they're older. And so eventually, universal white male suffrage partially inspires the education reform, but it still wasn't a sufficient education. So during this time, before significant reform, education was only really used as a tool by the rich to control the poor and really plant these ideas of this is your place, this is what you're going to do, and sort of put them in a box. However, with Horace Mann, this all changes, and Horace Mann was the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education and advocated for more and better schoolhouses, larger school terms, higher pay for teachers, and more variety in the curriculum. Curriculum used to be very math, English, reading. That's basically it. And he wanted to expand that so that people get greater education and, know more about the world. Others expanded on his progress by writing books that taught kids about how to be a patriotic citizen. And as a result of this, you also see higher learning reform, and states built new colleges with federal land grants and expanded the areas of learning. So again, education reform is not just limited to primary school, it's going even farther than that to colleges and universities, which is super important. However, you need to remember that there were still a lot of problems. For example, slaves still couldn't be educated, and society frowned upon women for going to college because they preferred a homemaker. They didn't think women would ever need it in their lives, and they thought it would hurt women's brains because they couldn't handle that much information. It's disgusting that they thought that, but that was the norm at the time. And so yeah, even though this is definitely a significant step in the right direction, it's not enough to completely solve the issues of the time. Another area of reform you should know about is with prison and mental health reform. And to give a little background again, most criminals were often brutally punished for very minor offenses, and the mentally ill fared far worse, as beliefs about them shifted from, they're cursed by demons to they chose to be crazy. People really thought that being mentally ill was a voluntary thing, and that it was their own fault and they just had to get over it. But this really starts to shift a little bit when Dorothea Dix travels to mental asylums and prisons around the world and documents the poor treatment of the patients. And it overall leads to better treatment and a new belief that the mentally ill are not inherently responsible for their conditions. It is literally the same in its effects as a physical disease. It's just happening within the person and you can't see that. So this overall just destigmatizes the whole discussion around mental illness a little bit compared to the contemporary standards of the time, but obviously a lot of work is still left to be done. And this next one is kind of unrelated to the whole prison mental health area, but it was definitely something you could know about, which is William Ladd's efforts to maintain international peace. He also advocated for new organizations that promoted collective security, and this made some progress because the American group worked with a similar European group, but it ultimately failed with the onset of the Civil War. So just something to know about. Another area of reform is temperance, and to provide some background on this, as life became more monotonous because of industrialization, drinking increased because people aren't, stimulated by the life around them. It's very wake up this time, go to sleep this time, and do it on repeat for years and years and years. And some worried that this would reduce the efficiency and quality of work done in the factory, while others worried that it would disrupt family life by making men physically violent. This is really where women come into the whole reform movement, especially concentrated in temperance. It was kind of seen as the responsibility to take on temperance because after all, they were in charge of the home. They were in charge of making sure everything was going according to plan, and temperance allowed them to sort of carry this out. And these actions to encourage temperance are carried out through the American Temperance Society, which was formed in 1826, and essentially it implored members to not drink alcohol and also published books and pamphlets describing the effects a tavern, which was a place that served alcohol, could have on a once happy village. They created these almost dystopian novels of taverns destroying an entire village because of alcohol. So it was kind of like a form of propaganda in a way. You should also note that aside from this, they did pursue legal means to some avail. They did make some progress. For example, with the Maine Law of 1851, this prohibited the making and sale of alcohol in Maine. And although, like many laws, it was later repealed and overall ineffective, these types of laws did lead to some decrease in drinking. So overall, these temperance laws were largely unsuccessful. Even the federal amendment, the 18th Amendment, later in the early 1900s, would prove to be unsuccessful in the long run, but it was a temporary step and it did decrease drinking to some extent. Aside from these reforms, one movement that you should definitely be paying attention to during this time is the women's movement. They're making some very significant progress. And to provide some background again, women were allowed to get beaten by their husbands, they had to give up their property once they got married, and they were generally expected to stay home. So clearly, women are, allowed to be abused, allowed to be taken advantage of, and overall not given much respect in a lot of ways. And though they were considered weak both physically and emotionally, they were sort of seen as this moral compass for society. So if something was going wrong, the women would bring it up. This is how they, again, get involved in temperance. So there is some sort of, authority associated with women, but clearly not enough to make men respect them, so that's kind of sad. But there is some progress made with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and essentially this was a meeting of women's rights advocates in New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton reads the Declaration of Sentiments, which was this revised version of the Declaration of Independence, which said, "All men and women are created equal." And this is really seen as the first step in the modern feminist movement. However, suffrage is eventually overshadowed by abolition because that's the more urgent issue at the time. But again, this Declaration of Sentiments is super important because it shows that women are really starting to be more cognizant and willing to take action with the inequalities that they're facing in terms of how society is treating them compared to men, and they want to be represented. Unfortunately, they aren't going to make significant progress until the early 1900s with the 19th Amendment that gives them the right to vote. Again, this is because abolition is the more urgent problem at the moment. And finally, let's talk about utopian societies and just in general other ideas, miscellaneous ideas from this chapter. Now, in terms of utopian societies, you should note that they were really formed to resist industrialization and materialism by really basing societies on communal work and shared prosperity, and ultimately many of them failed. They were very almost like culty. It was odd, but there were some that were definitely working for some time. For example, New Harmony, this was a society of Owenites in Indiana. You have Brook Farm, which was created in Massachusetts and inspired by Transcendentalism. And you have the Oneida community, which practiced free love, birth control, and eugenics, where the best parents would mate to produce the best offspring, and they generally believed having possessions would breed selfishness and jealousy, so everything was shared. This was basically communism. Aside from the utopian societies, there are other ideas during this time. You have a lot of improvements in science, for example, and keep in mind that although the medicines doctors were prescribing were poisonous at best, some progress was made with anesthesia, which was invented in the 1840s, so people no longer have to bear through the pain. There's a little bit of improvement there. You also see improvements in architecture and painting, and keep in mind that although America is developing some sense of self, most of it is copied from the rest of the world and generally European countries. For example, the federal style was inspired by Roman and Greek architecture and eventually expanded following the Greek revival in the 1850s. In terms of painting, many painters struggled to find wealthy people who would pay them to paint. Again, hiring people to paint was a very, rich person only type of thing, and obviously poverty was at an all-time high during this time because of industrialization, so people didn't really find a need to have people paint them or whatever. And in general, it was frowned upon by society. They thought it was a waste of time, but the Hudson River School still continued to teach people how to paint nature and landscapes. So this allows for some sense of American art to develop. You also see that the American sense of literature is starting to develop. You have this idea of romanticism, which encouraged imaginative stories instead of ones based on reality, and emphasized the importance of a person and their feelings or intuition. And this allowed for a greater experimentation and really was the first example of original American-born art. So they're, starting to get somewhere. And some really important authors that developed this movement were Henry David Thoreau, who lived alone in a cabin for 2 years and wrote a book about what he learned, which is called Walden, and then Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. So yeah, that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like and subscribe, all of that, you know the drill. And yeah, see you in the next chapter.